G'day, in this video I'm going to show you how you can calculate a yield potential and more importantly how you can calculate a target yield for your paddock or your crop for your farm. And so before we get into the calculations, it's important to define some of the terminology. So we have a whole range of different types of yields and each of those describe different potentials of the crop. So right at the top we have yield potential. Now this is the genetic potential of the crop. And so that's more or less seen under ideal conditions in the best conditions for that particular crop. A step down from that is our potential yield. So this is the yield that could be achieved in a given area. So this is the best area. This is our any given area. So this is area specific, given unlimited amounts of water, nutrition, like the ideal conditions for that crop in a particular area. So this is typically going to be limited by, say, sunlight. As you get further away from the equator, sunlight's going to change depending on the time of year, and solar radiation. Now, these two are great to know. Our potential yield is more important for irrigated crops, where you aren't so much limited by really anything. It's just the economic limitation. You can apply as much water within economic limitations as well as fertilizer. So this potential yield, very important for irrigated crops. And the only way you can determine that is really with fieldwork for your area. There's no calculation you can do. This is really governed by different genetics and fieldwork. But what's more important for us, and especially the clients I work with, is our potential yield, which is limited by water, or the water limited potential yield. And this is, in Australia, what we try to achieve, or what we kind of aim to or aspire to achieve, because water in our context is one of the most valuable resources we have. We don't have much of it, so we've got to make sure we maximize as much of this type of yield as possible. And so this type of yield is when everything else is sufficient for the crop and water is the limiting factor. And I'll go on to describing how we can calculate this, because from here we can calculate our other things. Next is economic yield. Economic yield is the ideal yield for the highest amount of profit for a crop. And so just because you can actually achieve the highest amount of yield doesn't necessarily mean you're going to produce the highest amount of profit for that crop, because you're going to get diminishing turns with more and more fertilizer, and there's always a cost to that. So typically the economic yield is set at about 80% of the potential yield limited by water. And then finally we have our actual yield, or our farmer yield. So this typically has an overall step-down approach, as we're limited by more and more things. By the time we get to our farmer yield, or our actual yield, there's a whole range of things affecting the crop. There's going to be management practices, so whether or not you got enough nitrogen, whether or not you got a sufficient amount of other fertilizer, a whole range of different things prevent us from achieving our economic yield and our water limited yield. And so to start off, we're going to try and estimate our water limited potential yield. And for this, we use this formula developed by French and Schultz in 1984. And they kind of developed the framework of how to estimate our water limited yield potential. They did a bunch of research in Australia. There's been a few improvements to this, and there's a lot of limitations in this. And we won't so much touch on it now, but there are a lot of limitations. It's important to know that this is a very general, high-level estimate on our water limited yield potential, and there's better models out there that estimate it. But given the amount of variation you're going to get within the season and everything else that goes on, estimating your yield potential, or your water limited yield potential, down to the kilo doesn't really matter, because you're going to get all this variation throughout the season anyways. So having a general idea of where it sits can allow you to firstly target an economic threshold that we can calculate from this, and see how your crops benchmark compared to this. So first up, we have our water use efficiency. This is the ability for our crop to convert water into a product. And so when I say product, that can either be grain, for typically what we work with wheat, or it could also be a pasture-based crop. And that would be expressed in kilograms of dry matter per hectare. And so our water use efficiency is usually expressed in kilograms per hectare per millimeter. And so you can get a whole range of different estimates on that. And this will change depending on your location, as well as your soil. A whole range of different factors affect this. As a general rule of thumb for wheat, it's about 20 kilos per hectare per millimeter. Broadleaf crops like canola can range between 10 to 15. But again, it depends on the area, and you can go to the blog as is attached to this video on our website, and you can see a list of what I found in terms of the water use efficiencies, as well as this formula you can use to calculate it yourself. So now we have effectively a conversion number that converts the amount of rainfall we have or the water we have available into grain. Now what we want to know is the amount of water we have on hand. And so there's three components to this. There's the water we save during fallow, there's the water we get in crop, and then we're going to minus off evaporation, which is what we lose during the growing season. And so the first component of this is our water left over after fallow. And so this is typically going to be our November to March rain times by a fallow efficiency multiplier. And so that will range depending on your ground cover. If you have no ground cover or less than 10% ground cover, I think it's around 15% of the water you get during these months actually go into the crop. So say you get 100 mil of rain, you're only going to get 15 mil of that. Next we go on to our in-season rain. So April, October, typically we're going to get 100% of that. And then we're going to minus the evaporation and to some extent our runoff for this growing season. And so there's a few different ways to estimate this. One way is you can just take 30% of our in-season rainfall. So say you get 400 mil of rain, 30% is going to be 120 mils. This is going to vary a lot depending on your area. The rate of evaporation for different areas change depending on temperature and wind and humidity and all that. The other factors is when you're sowing. So if you sow early, you're going to develop your crop canopy much faster, meaning you're going to get more water through transpiration rather than evaporation, which is more useful for the crop. So that's one estimate. The other estimate is that we can use 110 millimeters, or that's for wheat, as our evaporation number. But again, this number is also going to change depending on how much water you've had, the frequency of that water, as well as even the crop itself. And so there's a whole range of different factors that affect this. Somewhere around that 100 to 110 millimeter mark is good enough. And once you have all those numbers, you plug it all in together and you get your water limited yield potential. So as an example, we'll go through a crop in say Dubbo. So we're going to assume we're going to get a wheat crop. Now a wheat crop typically has a water use efficiency of around 20. Now some varieties will have a higher water use efficiency. Some of the modern varieties is starting to push around 25 kilos per millimeter per hectare, but we're just going to go with 20 for this one. Now, what you can do with this is you can actually do a few things. You can either take the long-term weather forecast, and so that's what we'll be doing here with Dubbo. We'll be taking the long-term average rainfall, but what you could actually do is you can have this as a rolling average of what has currently happened over fallow. You're making your fertilizer decisions, and we'll touch on this in another video where we talk about nitrogen budgeting, but you have already had your fallow rainfall, and you can use those numbers in this calculation rather than using historical numbers. You use historical numbers for the months that haven't happened yet, but looking backwards, you can actually see what's happened in the past. But for this example, we're just going to use historical numbers. So the fallow season for the Dubbo area got about 263 millimeters. Now we're going to say our farmers have been practicing a whole range of different good practices, so stubble retention, making sure they're covering the ground as much as possible, and it has achieved a fallow efficiency of 25%. So we're going to then times our fallow rainfall number by 25%. So once we have that number, we're looking at an in-season rainfall. Now because we're looking at historical data, we're going to say that is 320 millimeters. And then finally, we're going to minus our evaporation rate, also called the water threshold, as other people like to put it, the amount of water required before you actually start producing grain. And so we're going to say this is about 100 millimeters And so putting that all together, we're going to get a water limited wheat yield of around 5.7 tons a hectare. So this means that if we were to supply all the right nutrition at all the right times, and make sure all management practices are achieved, like making sure we don't have too many weeds, we're going to achieve a 5.7 ton crop of wheat. But the thing is, the real world doesn't work like that, and there are financial constraints that prevent us from achieving that. And so a better number to target for our yield target is 80% of that number. So we take our 5.7 tons, we times it by 0.8 or 80%, and we're left with a economic yield of 4.5 tons. And so if you're a Dubbo farmer, it means that you should be trying to target an economic yield of around 4.5 tons. Now, of course, all of this is built on so many assumptions that more or less it's going to change, but this is a good point to then start building a fertilizer program or a nutrition program on. Now, say for example, we don't get enough nitrogen on our crop, that's actually going to reduce that to our actual yield, and it might be a lot lower than that. Now, the reason why the economic yield is about 80% of the water limited yield, and it's because the best growers in the area tend to achieve that 80% mark of the water limited yield potential. And so GRDC and kind of the standard in which you apply this typically go with an 80%. So if you can achieve more than that, closer to the water limited yield potential, then that's fantastic, and it really shows that you're a good farmer. But if you're achieving that 4.5 ton or the economic yield potential, that's a really good goal to aim for. Now again, this is for an average year that are used from the BOM weather data. You can actually pull up your own weather data, put in these numbers, and get a rough estimate of what your area could yield. And of course, there's going to be differences between your best and worst paddocks. Cool, so that's really it. Keep this in mind when we go on to a future video about how we can budget nitrogen and how it's really important for regenerative farmers to do that, because typically what we find is that you hear about regenerative farming and you don't quite need to apply as much fertilizer, which is true, and they jump straight into it. They typically get really bad yields because they didn't do it properly, and that's what we help farmers do. Move to regenerative practices without losing yield. So if that sounds like something you'd be interested in, we offer a free consultation on our website, so go check it out. You can sign up, it's completely free, and we can have a chat. Awesome, thanks for watching. My name's Till Simmons. Cheers.